What if, and this is a chilling thought, what if the place you trusted to keep your child safe, a place where they should be nurtured and protected, what if it was actually harboring a deadly secret?
That's a chilling thought indeed.
Today, we're diving deep into a story that unfolded in a seemingly, from the outside, totally ordinary Bronx daycare.
And the name of the daycare almost adds an extra layer of irony to the whole situation,
I was just going to say that.
It was called Deino Nino.
Which, for our listeners who may not be familiar with Spanish, that actually translates to divine child.
Divine child.
Just wow, just a gut punch when you think about
It
it.
really is.
This isn't just another news story.
Yeah.
This is a parent's worst nightmare.
Yeah, it really cuts to the core of that trust that we place in caregivers. I mean, what makes this case so disturbing really is the stark contrast, between this facade that the daycare presented to the world and then the horrifying reality that was discovered within its walls.
Absolutely. I mean, you think your kid is going to this place to play, to learn, to be with other kids.
Right, to be in a safe and nurturing environment. And Nino was right there, nestled in a residential neighborhood in Kingsbridge.
Seems totally normal.
And get this, it had even passed like an unannounced inspection. Like the authorities just showed up
Oh, wow.
with no violations just days before the tragedy happened.
Just days before. It's almost unimaginable.
It really is. It's like how could this be the case?
And then, September 15th, 2023, this is when everything just kind of explodes.
Right.
Several children are found unresponsive after nap time. A neighbor reported hearing Gray Mendez, she's the daycare owner, frantically screaming, "The kids are dead."
Screaming, the kids are dead, can you imagine? And then the scene that greeted first responders was pure chaos.
Oh, I bet.
Just utter chaos. You have children, they were described as being pale, struggling to breathe. And tragically, 1-year-old Nicholas Dominici lost his life.
Oh, my gosh.
3 other children, thankfully, were revived with Narcan. That's the medication, of course, that's used to reverse opioid overdoses.
So right away, it's clear that something's really wrong here.
Absolutely.
And the cause of this horrific incident, a kilo of fentanyl was found hidden in the daycare,
A kilo,
on top of the playmats.
where the children had been sleeping.
Just, I can't even imagine.
It's chilling. It really is a chilling reminder of just how potent fentanyl is. We're talking, a tiny amount, as little as 2 milligrams can be fatal for an adult.
2 milligrams.
2 milligrams, that's all it takes. To think that these young children were exposed to such a large quantity, a kilo, I mean.
It's unbelievable.
It really is horrifying. And, the investigation revealed that this wasn't just a small stash. A kilo presses were found in the daycare, suggesting a large-scale drug operation was taking place.
So this wasn't someone just, hiding a little something for personal use.
No, this was a much bigger operation.
So who was behind this? Well, the investigation quickly led to the arrests of 2 people.
Right.
First, we have Gray Mendez, the daycare owner.
Right.
And then Caristo Acevedo Brito. He is her husband's cousin who was renting a room in the daycare.
So you have this familial connection right there in the daycare.
In the heart of it.
Yeah.
And both were charged with assault, manslaughter, and murder. And despite their pleas of innocence, they were denied bail.
Right. The judge clearly felt like the evidence was strong enough to warrant that. But the investigation didn't stop there.
Because there's this third person, and this is someone who quickly becomes really central to this whole story, Gray's husband, Felix Herrera Garcia.
Exactly. Felix is believed to be the mastermind behind the drug operation, and there's security footage
Oh, no.
showing him leaving the daycare with filled plastic bags just minutes before the police arrived.
Oh, wow.
And what's really interesting is that he chose to exit through the back door.
Oh, so not the main entrance where everyone else would be coming and going?
Exactly, trying to slip away, unnoticed perhaps. It's incredibly suspicious behavior. Now, to be fair, Gray has maintained her innocence throughout this whole ordeal, claiming she was utterly shocked, devastated by the events.
I mean, if that's true, that is just, wow, the worst possible, betrayal, right?
Absolutely. And her lawyer has even argued that she's a victim in all this, that she's paying for someone else's crime. But there are some inconsistencies in her story that raise serious doubts.
I'm dying to know the details here.
Okay, so for starters, phone records show that before calling 911, Gray made several calls, including 2 to her husband.
Before 911.
Before 911. So it begs the question, why contact him before seeking help for the children?
That is a very good question. I mean, if my kid is in trouble, the first thing I'm doing is calling for help. I'm not calling my husband.
Right. So it does seem awfully suspicious, like she was, maybe more worried about covering her tracks than the kids in her care. And then there's the issue of the deleted messages. Over 21,000 messages between Gray and her husband were deleted from her phone before it was handed over to authorities.
Whoa. 21,000. That's a lot of messages to delete.
It is, and those messages can be recovered. And one reportedly reveals Felix instructing Gray to tell police he was at work and to get a lawyer.
Okay, so that doesn't really support this whole innocent bystander narrative.
Not at all, not at all. And there are even allegations from Gray's past that complicate the picture even further.
Oh,
Her first husband's family claims that she manipulated him into marriage to obtain a green card and that her personality changed drastically after moving to New York City.
wow. So we have a web of conflicting narratives and suspicious circumstances surrounding Gray Mendez. But the investigation didn't end there.
No, it didn't.
There's a third arrest, Renny Antonio Paredes, nicknamed El Gallo, which means the rooster.
The rooster.
He was charged with conspiracy to distribute narcotics, resulting in death.
So now we have this third player who enters the scene, and authorities believe that Rennie was deeply involved in the drug operation. What's interesting is that glassine envelopes with a distinctive Red Dawn stamp were found at both the daycare and Rennie's apartment, indicating a clear link between the two.
So it's like the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together.
Exactly. The net is tightening around this whole drug ring. But the alleged ringleader, Felix Herrera Garcia, he's still on the loose at this point.
Right, he took off before the police got there.
He did. And authorities launched a full-scale manhunt. And eventually, it led them to the Mexican border.
So they're thinking he's trying to get out of the country.
That's right.
So what happened? Did they catch him?
They did, but the location of his capture is particularly fascinating.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. Where did they find him?
Felix was apprehended on a bus heading to Culiacan, Mexico.
Culiacan. Okay, so why is that significant?
Well, Culiacan is a known stronghold of the Sinaloa cartel.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that this Bronx daycare drug bust might be connected to the Sinaloa cartel?
It's a possibility.
That is a whole other level of disturbing.
It definitely raises the stakes. And it speaks to the expansive reach of these criminal organizations. I mean, think about it. From a small daycare in the Bronx to potentially, the Sinaloa cartel. Felix's intended destination suggests he may have been seeking protection or even planning to further integrate into the cartel's operations.
This is getting really intense.
Yeah.
But thankfully they caught him before he could just disappear.
Exactly. Felix was arrested, extradited back to the United States to face charges.
So where do things stand now?
All 4 suspects are currently in custody, awaiting trial. But this case is far from over.
Of course.
The investigation is ongoing.
I mean, there are so many unanswered questions still.
Absolutely there are. We still don't know the full extent of the drug operation, how long it had been running, and perhaps, most importantly, how something like this could happen in a place meant to protect children.
It's a question that I think every parent is asking right now.
Yeah. And those are questions that we'll be exploring in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into this heartbreaking and frankly terrifying case.
Yeah.
This case, I mean, it really brings the whole fentanyl crisis, into sharp focus. It's not just a problem in, certain neighborhoods or for certain groups of people anymore. It's everywhere, it feels like. It can penetrate, seemingly safe spaces like a daycare with absolutely devastating results.
It's a harsh reality, there's no doubt about that. And it makes you wonder, right, how can we better protect our children from this danger? What safeguards, what can we put in place to prevent something like this from ever happening again?
It's a question that keeps me up at night, honestly. It's like we need a first aid course, but for the opioid epidemic, for fentanyl specifically.
I think that's a really good analogy.
Parents, teachers, caregivers, everyone needs, I think, the knowledge, the tools, to be able to respond effectively if they encounter this deadly drug.
Exactly. It starts with awareness, right? We need to educate people about fentanyl, how to recognize an overdose, and how to administer Narcan in an emergency. But it can't just be about individual preparedness.
Right, because you can't expect, every parent or teacher to become like a drug expert.
Exactly. We need a systemic approach, too.
So what does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think we need to look at strengthening the regulations and the oversight of of daycare facilities.
So like more frequent inspections, more rigorous inspections.
Exactly. Maybe surprise inspections. And what about background checks
Oh yeah.
for all employees, not just the owners? I mean, wouldn't it be a huge red flag if, someone with a history of drug dealing was working at a daycare?
That seems like common sense, right? Like why
Yeah.
wouldn't we be doing that already?
You would think, right? Absolutely. But more comprehensive background checks could definitely help identify potential risks for sure.
Okay, but what about the bigger picture? I mean, you mentioned a systemic approach. So we're talking about background checks, regulations, but what about, addressing the root causes of the fentanyl crisis as a whole?
Right. And I think that's where it gets really complicated because we're talking about, tackling the overprescription of opioids, expanding access to addiction treatment, and disrupting the supply chains that bring fentanyl into our communities. I mean, we're talking about like a multi-pronged approach, from the medical community, from law enforcement.
Feels like a problem with so many layers.
It does. It absolutely
Like
does.
it's going to take this massive coordinated effort, like almost like a war, like a war on fentanyl to really turn the tide on this epidemic.
It might. And what we've seen in this case, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that's important to
It's a
remember.
chilling thought.
It is. It is. And I think, going back to what you said about kind of like a first aid course for fentanyl prevention, early intervention, that's key here.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, I want to kind of circle back to Gray Mendez.
Okay.
Her claims of innocence, they seem increasingly unlikely, right, given the evidence.
Mhm.
But her lawyer still maintains that she was manipulated by her husband, that she was completely unaware of the drug operation. Is that is that a common defense strategy? Like, is that something that you see a lot in these kinds of cases?
It is. It is. We often see attempts to shift blame in these situations, to paint the defendant, especially when it's a woman, as a victim of circumstance, under the influence of a manipulative partner. But whether the jury will believe it, that's another question entirely. The prosecution, they're going to have to present a very strong case, to prove that Gray wasn't just aware of the drug activity, but was actively participating in it.
So that's what I'm wondering. Like, what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Yeah.
Because, we've talked about the phone records, the deleted messages, but is that enough? Like, is that enough to actually get a conviction?
Well, it'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out in court. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, as you said, but is it enough for a conviction? That's for the jury to decide. But the stakes are high. I mean, if they're convicted, Gray and her co-conspirators could face very lengthy prison sentences. We could be talking about life behind bars.
Wow. And what about, the other side of this? What about the families of the victims? What kind of justice, can they hope for?
Well, for Nicholas Dominici's family, I mean, nothing can bring back their son, right?
Yeah.
Like it's an unimaginable loss. But hopefully a guilty verdict, it would offer some sense of closure, of accountability.
Yeah, I guess that's all you can really hope for in a situation like this. And it's heartbreaking to think about, the other children who are exposed to fentanyl too. Are there long-term health effects? Like could this have lasting impacts on their health?
It's definitely a concern. Fentanyl exposure, it can have serious consequences for developing brains, for developing bodies. So it's crucial that these children receive ongoing medical care and support to address any
Uh,
any potential issues that might arise.
it's just a tragedy on so many levels.
It really is.
It's a reminder of, how fragile life is and the importance of staying vigilant, really paying attention to what's going on around you
Mhm.
and the devastating toll that the opioid crisis just continues to take, on individuals, on families, on communities.
You're absolutely right. It's a story that should serve as a wake-up call for all of us. We need to be proactive in protecting our children, our communities from the threat of fentanyl. And it's not just about a drug bust at a daycare. This is about, like you said, a systemic failure that allowed this tragedy to happen in the first place. We need to demand better.
We need to demand action.
We do.
This case has certainly brought the issue to the forefront, I think, of our national conversation. But that conversation, it needs to lead to concrete change. We'll be back shortly to wrap up our deep dive into this harrowing case. We've really unpacked the details of this case, all the horrifying details, the arrests, the manhunt, the conflicting narratives, all of that. But I guess I'm left wondering, I mean, what does it all mean? What can we actually take away from this beyond, the sheer horror of it all?
Yeah, I think For me, this case really, it just shatters the illusion that the fentanyl crisis is something that, happens somewhere else, to other people.
Right, right.
It's infiltrated our communities, I think, in ways that we couldn't have even imagined a few years ago. I mean, we tend to think of, drug busts happening in dark alleys or, abandoned warehouses, not in places dedicated to caring for children,
Right.
the places where we should feel the safest.
Yeah, it really shakes, I think, our sense of security,
Hmm.
to the core. Like as a parent, you think you've done everything you can to protect your child, and then something like this happens, and it's just like,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, what else can I do?
Yeah.
What am I missing?
Exactly. And that's why I think this case is such a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It highlights the importance of due diligence, and not just when choosing a daycare. I mean, in all aspects of our lives.
Yeah, yeah.
We need to be aware of the risks. We need to ask questions. We need to, trust our gut if something feels off, and that's hard, right? Because we want to believe, especially when it comes to people who are caring for children, we want to believe that they have our best interests at heart. But this case shows us that that's not always the case.
So it's a call to action, I think, for parents, for caregivers to be more proactive, to be more informed, to be honestly just more vigilant than ever before.
Absolutely. But I don't want people to hear this and just feel paralyzed by fear. I think instead it should empower us to take steps to protect ourselves, to protect our loved ones. And we can start, with the basics, educating ourselves about fentanyl, how potent it is, the signs of an overdose, knowing how to administer Narcan. I mean, that could literally save a life.
Yeah, no, I agree. Knowledge is power, especially in a situation like this.
Absolutely.
But I think, also we need to think about the bigger picture, right? On a larger scale, this case, it underscores the need for systemic change.
Hmm.
Like we've been talking about, we need tougher regulations for daycare facilities. We need more comprehensive background checks for employees. We need increased funding for drug prevention and treatment programs. All of these things.
Yeah, yeah. We can't just focus on punishing the individuals involved, right?
Yeah.
We need to address the root causes of the drug epidemic, and that's a complex problem. There's no easy solution.
It feels overwhelming, honestly.
Hmm.
But I keep thinking about, Nicholas Dominici and the other children, affected by this tragedy. And it's like we owe it to them, to do better, to demand better.
You're absolutely right. This case has sparked a national conversation, and that conversation, it needs to translate into meaningful action.
Yeah.
The lives of our children depend on it.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dives into the Dino daycare tragedy, I want to leave our listeners with this thought, this question. How can each of us, in our own way, contribute to making our communities safer and protecting the most vulnerable among us? It's a question I think that's worth reflecting on, worth talking about with your friends, with your family, and hopefully worth taking action on. Thanks for joining us for this very important and very difficult conversation. We'll see you next time.